Hello there and welcome to Exam AZ-900, Microsoft Azure Fundamental Study Guide. This is episode 32, Authentication versus Authorization. My name is Tim Warner. In the Azure Fundamentals AZ-900 objective domain, we're starting with Describe General Security and Network Security Features, coming into the subheading Describe Core Azure Identity Services, and our goal today is for you to understand the difference between authentication and authorization. Point your browser to timw.info/AZ900SG to see the full table of contents as well as YouTube links for each lesson in this series. Now, both authentication and authorization are crucial points of information security in general, but Microsoft Azure in particular. Security professionals and developers tend to shorten authentication to auth-n, so I just wanted to include that so you're not surprised if you see that reference in the literature. Specifically, authentication is the process of verifying the identity of a person or service requesting access. Now think of, for instance, when you sign into your favorite software as a service app. Evernote, Dropbox, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. We could think of probably 50 of these sites. When you sign in, what do you provide? You provide a user ID, right? It could be your email address, but you also include a password. The idea is only you, that is, the proper, legitimate identity, knows that password, so that's how the back-end server is able to validate that you are who you claim to be. Now, in business, there's more robust ways to protect what's called a security principle. A user would be an example of a security principle, but especially in Azure, we need to understand that identity goes beyond humans. You can actually have what are called service principles. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so let me calm down. Digital certificate provides another way for a security principle to demonstrate its identity. Biometric is pretty common nowadays. I can use Windows Hello on my Windows 10 devices, and the webcam sees my face, does facial recognition. I use an iPhone for my smartphone, and it has Touch ID, so biometric authentication is pretty common nowadays. And multi-factor authentication, or two-step verification, is where you use, for instance, an SMS text message or a 6-digit or 6-character code. Maybe it's longer than 6 characters. And the idea there is that you're providing not only something you know, your user ID and your password, but you would have to have your device on you physically in order to provide the second factor authentication. I guess who you are would be how you would describe biometric. Now, authorization is the bookend service in application identity. Authorization is shortened in the industry to Auth-Z. So we have Auth-N for authentication and Auth-Z for authorization. Now, here's the big difference. Authorization is establishing the access level an authenticated identity has to a resource. You see how that works? So you don't get to authorization until you've validated the person or service principal's identity. Once they're properly let into your application or your system, authorization defines their scope of authority or what they can do, which operations they can take in that environment. In Azure Resource Manager, we have Azure Active Directory, of course, and the way we secure access, one common way anyway, is role-based access control, in which a role is a collection of permissions that's aligned to a particular job role in the Azure ecosystem. There are built-in roles for application developers, security auditors, billing administrators, etc. And the idea is least privilege, where you're giving these security principals only enough authorization to let them do their jobs or whatever their tasks are, but no additional authorization. I mentioned Azure Active Directory. We're going to do a separate lesson on this. I believe it's next up in this series. Azure AD is the default identity store in Microsoft Azure, and it provides both authentication and single sign-on, SSO. I know I'm throwing a bunch of TLAs, 3-letter acronyms at you. And authorization is the second A. In information security, you often hear AAA called, and that third A stands for accounting, or you could look at it as auditing. Hopefully it makes sense that you would want a record of everybody who's attempted to authenticate to your system or to your application, whether those attempts were successful or failed. And you also want to make sure that there's an audit trail for authorizations. Again, access attempts that are either successful or failed. In this demonstration, I'd like to show you the difference between authentication and authorization in Microsoft Azure. And identity begins and ends in Azure Active Directory. So why don't I look up Azure Active Directory in my services list, and let's head on under Manage Users and to see what's going on. In particular, we're going to focus in on a fictional test user I've created called Melissa Gahn. Let's say that this person is a new hire in our organization, and let's say she's a developer. So eventually we'll be giving her role-based access directly to certain Azure resources. However, let's say that during her first week, we're going to start with just giving her read-only access so that she can come in and inspect the environment and not make a change, either inadvertently or intentionally, that could jeopardize our system. First, let's do authentication. Melissa does have her sign-in defined. It looks an awful lot like an email address, but it's officially the structure that Azure Active Directory uses for sign-ins. It's whatever the name piece is at, and then your business domain that you can verify with Microsoft and use in your Azure subscriptions. The best practice is to structure these sign-in names so they do mirror business email addresses. But she's going to use Melissa at timw.info. She's created a password. You can, as an administrator, reset here. But what I'm going to do is open in my Edge browser an in-private window, and I'm going to pretend I'm Melissa Gahn, and we're going to go to portal.azure.com. Now, without getting too into the weeds here, I want you to look up in the address bar. This doesn't say portal.azure.com anymore, does it? It says login.microsoftonline.com. This is a general authentication endpoint that will take you into a variety of Microsoft Cloud Platform services. Specifically here, the sign-in says, continue to Microsoft Azure. Well, how does Azure know which Azure Active Directory instance or tenant Melissa belongs to? Well, it's going to be her sign-in name. We provide her sign-in name and click Next. The screen appears to just shift the middle part. I keep intending to add some corporate branding to my Azure AD tenant to make it more obvious. Right now, we're now connected to my timw.info environment, and we're being prompted, or Melissa's being prompted for her password here. I've already got that typed in, so I click Sign In, and now an authentication process is taking place. The browser asks if it can cache her credentials in the browser, and I'll say yes just for now, not that it really matters. And now Melissa is into the Azure portal. Well, what can she do? She's been authenticated. What is her role? Specifically, let me dismiss this tour thing. If we were to try to inspect the environment, I mean, there's got to be some virtual machines or some other resources here. If Melissa were to take a browse over to resource groups, let's say, there's nothing here. What? We know in the upper right, we can see that Melissa's part of the timw.info directory. She's been authenticated, and because of that, she has at least view access to the portal itself, but no privileges at all in terms of Azure resources. We're going to fix that right now. I'm going to come back to my administrative session here, and why don't we go over to resource groups. I'm going to give Melissa read-only access to my Pluralsight resource group. We can verify that there are a few things in that resource group. It looks like there's an Azure SQL database, there's an Azure Data Explorer cluster, a storage account, so there's some artifacts in there. And the role-based access control in Azure begins and ends here at the Access Control IAM blade. We can click Add Role Assignment, and I'm going to choose a very common built-in role, Reader, and then we're going to look for her sign-in. I'll start to type Melissa. The portal in Azure AD resolves her account, so I'll select it and click Save. And now if we go to Role Assignments and scroll down to where the readers are, we can see that Melissa Gahn now has that access. Now that access is only in the Pluralsight resource group. Notice that in my subscription, I actually have another resource group called Instructor. You're going to see that Azure, for the most part, I say for the most part decidedly, will hide resources and controls that the user shouldn't have any access to. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. Let me come back to my incognito session, and we're going to have to sign out and sign back in to refresh her token, her access token inside of our subscription. So we'll come back in. We've cached her credentials. At least I thought we did. Oh well, I'll enter the password again. Again, we're authenticating and we're being taken into the portal as usual. And now we'll head right on over to resource groups again. And note that we now can see the Pluralsight resource group. Note we don't see the instructor resource group because she doesn't have any RBAC role membership at that scope. If we come in here, we can, for instance, go into our storage account and attempt to make a change. Let's live dangerously and attempt a delete operation. We'll click delete, type the name of the storage account to confirm. I'm just going to use good old copy and paste here, and we'll click delete, and what happens? Oh, fortunately, it says that she doesn't have the permission to perform this operation, and we know why. She has read access. So that's that. Pretty cool, huh? Now, the other thing I want to show you with authorization in particular happens back in Azure Active Directory. So again, let me type Active Directory and browse back to AD, and it deals with product licensing. If we go and look at Melissa Gaughan's profile again and come down to licenses, you can see that I've assigned her a Microsoft 365 E5 license. This is going to grant that user, Melissa, authorization to use those apps. This is a different way to go. It's different from role-based access control that I just showed you, but it's definitely in scope for our discussion. That's why I wanted to show this to you. And the easiest way for Melissa to get to those Microsoft 365 apps, and actually any app that you have that's running in Azure and that's using Azure Active Directory as its identity store, is to point your users towards what's called the Application Access Panel. Let me open up in private again. The well-known URL is https://myapps.microsoft.com. Again, myapps.microsoft.com. She's now going to authenticate one final time. And what the Application Access Panel is, it's a single sign-on portal for your Azure AD users. And you can customize the branding so you can replace this Microsoft with your own business. But because she has the Microsoft 365 license, she now has single sign-on or SSO authorization to all of those appropriate programs, including, for example, Excel Online. So we can, or she can click that, and without having to provide any additional credentials, she's in, she's ready to go, and she's productive. For learning resources, I'd like you to check out Microsoft's Learn lesson called Identity and Access. The short link for that is timw.info/AUT1. The official Azure documentation for authentication and authorization you can find at timw.info/AUT2. And if you're a developer or if you want to get under the covers more in how Azure Active Directory provides single sign-on to cloud apps, look at timw.info/AUT3. Excellent. Another lesson down. Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. The next episode is going to be Azure Active Directory, so I look forward to continuing it with you then. My Twitter handle is TechTrainerTim. My full-length courses are all in the Pluralsight library, timw.info/PS, and my website is techtrainertim.com. I look forward to hearing from you. Take good care, and thanks again.